Ralie Deffenbaugh, thank you very much for participating in this human rights project and for telling us a little bit about the churches and especially the Lutheran churches' involvement in the transition to independence in Namibia.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
It's a long time ago.
Yes.
For many people, and a lot of people might not really remember how the situation was in Namibia before its independence.
Right.
So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. You're right. It is a long time ago. Namibia became free in 1990, and of course there are many people now who weren't even born in 1990. And Namibia has been blessed since independence by being relatively peaceful, and a few flies in the ointment, but generally things have gone pretty well there since independence. And some people looking at it from a human rights perspective would probably say that it's rather boring right now in Namibia. It's not on the top of the list, anybody's list of bad countries in the world. And yet, before independence, Namibia really suffered. Suffered not only under foreign occupation, and a very violent, militarized foreign occupation, but also suffered under the South African apartheid system, this rigid racial discrimination that the South Africans imposed that divided people not only along racial lines, but also along tribal and ethnic lines, and had a sort of hierarchy of humanity there based on the color of one's skin. And it was a violent, degrading, terrible system, and a system that resulted in a lot of deaths. And in the case of Namibia, that system had been built upon a colonial system during the German time that some historians reckon to have been the first genocide of the 20th century during the German Herero War of 1904 to 1907, when two groups of Namibians, the Herero and the Nama, were literally decimated. Their populations reduced by more than half during that time. And there's some very, very chilling echoes of the German genocide in Namibia that reverberated 30 years later in the Nazi time in Germany itself. So the history of Namibia is one that was quite violent, quite bloody, full of oppression and repression, and it makes the miracle of the transition to independence and the role of the church in helping to work for peace in Namibia make that all the more amazing. And God forbid that other countries should have to go through what Namibia went through at that time.
Can you maybe give a quick overview about how the Lutheran Church was involved in the transition to the Namibian independence?
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting story. Why should the Lutherans be so interested in this little country in southwestern Africa that has so few people? But it comes out of the colonial history. Namibia used to be German Southwest Africa, and as part of the colonial rule in Namibia, missionaries went there, both German missionaries who worked in the south and the central part of the country, but also Finnish missionaries who were invited to work in the northern part of Namibia where most of the people live. So you had the creation then of fairly large Lutheran churches in Namibia, and to this day half of the Namibian people are Lutheran. Now, as also though an unfortunate part of the colonial history, during the German time there was a genocide in Namibia in the central and southern part of the country. And then in World War I, Namibia was occupied by South Africa as part of the Allied war effort. South Africa continued to control Namibia throughout most of the 20th century and implemented its apartheid policies and its racial discrimination policies in Namibia, so that the people there were really suffering not only under foreign occupation, but also suffering under the racist apartheid system. And as member churches of the Lutheran World Federation, the Namibian Lutherans let others know what was happening to them and asked for the solidarity and the assistance of Lutherans elsewhere in the world, so that the cause of freedom and independence in Namibia became a cause not just for the Namibians, but for their Lutheran partners throughout the Lutheran World Federation.
Okay, so thank you. So how were you actually personally involved in that particular issue of the transition to independence?
Well, I'm a lawyer by training, and when I was in law school, I decided that I wanted to take a year off from law school and volunteer myself and work somewhere in the developing world. Lutheran World Federation responded and said, we want someone with some legal knowledge to go to Namibia and help observe political trials, work with the churches in their legal defense efforts and so forth, and basically to report on the situation. So in 1975, as a 23-year-old law student, I went down to Namibia and had hoped to spend a whole year there, but the South Africans didn't renew my residence permit, so it ended up being 7 months. Nevertheless, I was able to observe a major political trial and report back on that, and got very much involved and knowledgeable about the situation in Namibia, and got to know many of the Namibian Christians and many of the lawyers and church people and others. And when I left Namibia, I left part of my heart there too, and kept involved over the years. LWF wanted me to come work for them right out of law school. They liked the work I had done in Namibia. But at that time I said, no, I need to go get my law license and get my legal credentials in order. So I turned down the offer then, but 4 years later LWF renewed the offer, and in 1981 I moved to Geneva and worked for 4 years as assistant to the General Secretary at Lutheran World Federation, working on legal and international affairs issues with a particular emphasis on Namibia and South Africa. And then in 1985, moved back to the States and took up duty as head of the Lutheran Office for World Community in New York, which I headed for 6 years. And during the end of that time, I had the real privilege of being invited back to Namibia for the year of transition to independence. The Lutheran bishops there, Bishop Dumaney and Bishop Frederick at that time, invited me to come to serve as a legal advisor for them. And I left my family back in the States and went to Namibia for a year, and was able to be involved with the church's efforts in election monitoring and the relations between the church and the UN, and then later on with the Constitution drafting and so forth. And it was a real joy to see Namibia go from warfare to peace, and to see free and fair elections, and to see the country become independent with a constitution that was adopted unanimously.
So you actually have been to Namibia at this time, but you were also director of the Lutheran Office for World Community in New York.
Yes.
So can you describe a little bit about how your work there was related to Namibia, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there were two main aspects of the work in New York at the World Community Office that related to Namibia. One was with the U.S. public and the U.S. political system to try to raise up awareness about the situation in Namibia, to help raise the issue of Namibia with members of Congress and with the administration, and to try to make sure that Namibia would not be forgotten. And the office there played, I think, a quite important role, together with other support groups like National Namibia Concerns and others, in terms of really building an advocacy grassroots network for Namibia within the United States. And it was really the Lutherans who were the base of that Namibia lobby, if you like, within the U.S. And then the other effort, I think, was with the United Nations itself there, in New York, to try to as a non-governmental organization, to try to keep the issue of Namibia alive at the UN. We were a very important source of accurate and reliable information about Namibia. Often we would hear from the church people in Namibia or from Lutheran World Federation about what was going on there. We would get that information to the UN or to some of the major UN diplomatic missions and so forth, and that helped then inform the UN's own deliberations about Namibia and helped reinforce the role of the United Nations as it worked for independence in Namibia.